The merciless sun over Redemption Creek painted the dust in shimmering waves of gold, and every sound of cattle hooves, wooden wagon wheels, and men's rough laughter tangled together like a fevered song of survival. Yet, in the middle of that noise, stood a man who belonged both to the chaos and apart from it. Jonathan Hale, with his storm-grey eyes and shoulders carved from years of work, leaned against a fence as though the world could not shake him. But even he could not have known that fate was about to unravel quietly before him, not with the crash of thunder, but with the soft, steady gaze of a girl whose silence carried more force than a shout. The crowd pressed closer to a trader's pen, voices buzzing with crude jokes, and there she was. Clara Rose, rope biting into her wrists, her hair tangled, her face bruised yet stubbornly radiant with an inner fire no cruelty could extinguish. Men called her damaged, useless, a mute without worth. Jonathan knew better the instant her eyes lifted. In them lived wildness unbroken, healing strength untamed, and an unspoken plea that did not beg, but instead challenged the heart of anyone willing to truly see her. That single glance pierced through years of dust and armor he had built around himself, and something within him shifted, alive again. The weight of choice pressed on him, turn away like the others, or act. His lips moved before he thought, his voice cutting through the market's din. "I'll take her." Laughter rose, mocking him for trading $50 not for a horse, but for a girl. Yet as the rope was cut and her wrists were freed, the stir of destiny wound tighter between them. Clara stood unsteady, but her silence held a quiet dignity that made the jeers fall hollow. Jonathan guided her through the crowd, the noise dimming as if the air itself bent to the moment. In the wagon's shadow, she climbed in, her knees drawn up, her body small against the vast Texas sky. He told himself he had no place for another life on his ranch, no business carrying a stranger into his solitude. Still, every step of the horses forward seemed to echo a promise neither of them yet dared to name. Dust curled behind them like a veil, hiding the town, carrying them into a wilderness that would demand every ounce of strength, every flicker of trust, and more love than either had thought possible. As the wagon rolled toward the storm-marked horizon, Jonathan felt her presence like a pulse just behind his shoulder. For a fleeting breath, he thought he heard a hum, faint and melodic, threading the heavy air, a sound too soft for one said to be voiceless. He didn't speak of it, but in that whisper of music lived the first seed of healing, of a romance wild as the horses he once broke, a romance that would test them, wound them, and save them in equal measure. Their story was just beginning, drawn on a canvas of dust, storm, and firelight, a story that you, dear listener, carry with you now. If these words stir something gentle within you, like a balm for hidden aches, let that warmth guide your heart. Leave a kind comment, share your thoughts, subscribe for more, and keep walking with us on this trail where love and resilience bloom even in the harshest lands. For sometimes the quietest voices sing the loudest songs, and this song has only begun to play, leading seamlessly into the uncertain, beautiful path ahead. The trail stretched long beneath the wagon wheels, a steady rhythm against the silence that hovered between them. Yet that silence was not empty. It pulsed, filled with the unspoken, the fragile beginnings of trust, and the quiet hum of something neither dared name. The land rolled outward in golden plains and scattered mesquite, the horizon bruised with storm clouds that promised both danger and cleansing. Jonathan kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the reins, but his thoughts strayed to the girl seated just behind him. Clara rose, small and still, her knees drawn to her chest, but her gaze never drifting like a lost child's might. No, she looked at the world as though she could feel its heartbeat, as though even without sound she understood more than most men who filled the air with careless words. When the sky darkened and the air grew heavy, he felt the shift in his horses before he saw the storm, a sandstorm gathering with merciless speed. He scanned the horizon for shelter, but the land mocked him with emptiness. Then a touch on his sleeve startled him. Clara had moved closer, her dark eyes steady, her hand pointing southward to nothing but barren scrub. He almost dismissed it, but there was certainty in her gesture, something fierce and grounding. She pressed her hand against her chest, then back toward the unseen land, as if saying, "Trust me." And so he did. He snapped the reins, urging thunder and lightning faster, their hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth as the wind began to roar. At the last moment, just as dust clawed across the sky, a hidden canyon revealed itself, a narrow cut in the earth no map had ever promised. Jonathan guided them down, the walls rising high and shielding them from the storm's rage. In that hollow he found not just safety, but a strange sense of grace. Clara moved with calm efficiency, helping secure supplies, gathering stray items, her thin frame steady even as the storm howled above. Side by side, they worked until the world outside vanished into a brown, seething blur. When at last the fury lessened, Jonathan turned and found her close, his coat draped over her shoulders, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. For a breath, everything else, the dust, the danger, the past, fell away, leaving only the fragile thread between them, fragile but strong enough to hold. By the fire that night he spoke his name aloud, pointing to himself, Jonathan. She studied his lips with that intense, unnerving focus, then lifted a hand to her chest and shaped her silent name. Clara. The warmth that filled the space between them was not born of the fire, but of recognition, the first true connection woven into their solitude. And in that hidden canyon, beneath the healing hush that follows a storm, Jonathan Hale realized that nothing about this girl was broken, and that tomorrow would demand answers he was not yet ready for. Still, as the embers glowed low, and Clara touched her hand to her heart before extending it toward him in silent gratitude, he felt something awaken in him, something that would carry them forward into a life neither had imagined, but both had already begun to claim. The dawn would bring his ranch, the test of daily survival, and 1,000 questions, but tonight carried its own quiet promise, leading them gently, inevitably into the next chapter of their story. The ranch came into view as the wagon crested the final ridge, a scattering of adobe walls, weathered wood, and coral fences pressed against the open sky. To Jonathan, it had always been both a refuge and a burden. His creation, his cage, his pride and his loneliness bound together in one patch of land. He felt that old familiar weight in his chest, but when he glanced at Clara, perched quiet and observant beside him, the place looked different, almost as if her gaze had softened its edges. She studied everything with intent. The main house small but steady, the barn standing tall though scarred by seasons, the chicken coop alive with movement, the fields rolling out in humble defiance of the desert. Her eyes lingered on the horses, and for the first time since he had seen her, something within her expression gentled, softened like a touch of healing rain on parched ground. Before he could speak, she was down from the wagon, drawn toward the corral as though her very heartbeat lived there. Jonathan watched as Liberty, his stubborn old mare who distrusted nearly every stranger, pricked her ears forward and walked straight to the fence with none of her usual caution. Clara reached out a tentative hand, her palm settling against the horse's neck, and then she closed her eyes. The air seemed to still around them, a quiet communion that no word could ever explain. When she opened her eyes again, she turned to Jonathan with urgency and pointed to Liberty's leg. He frowned, doubtful, but when he checked, there it was, swelling and heat hidden beneath the skin, an ailment he might not have noticed until it grew worse. She had known instantly, without sight, without words. Her gift was not rumor, it was truth. The days that followed wove themselves into an unexpected rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, lantern light glowing faintly through the barn's slats, her form moving with purpose among the animals. The chickens clustered at her feet, the half-wild cats purred against her legs, and the horses leaned into her touch, as though they had been waiting all their lives for such gentle understanding. Jonathan found himself pausing in his own work, his calloused hands stilled on rope or plough, just to watch her. She worked silently, yet spoke volumes through her hands, her posture, her eyes, every gesture its own language. And though he had once thought his ranch no place for another, he began to see how she filled it, how she healed the spaces that had long been hollow. Nights brought a different kind of intimacy. The small fire in the hearth, the scent of worn leather and mesquite smoke, the hush that stretched between them like a bridge slowly forming. Sometimes he caught her humming low in her chest, that strange melody that seemed to calm even the restless stallion Grant. He never pressed her about it, only listened, allowing the sound to settle deep into him like medicine against old wounds. And though she still slept in the barn, tucked safely among the creatures she trusted, there was no denying the invisible thread tightening each day between them, drawing her further into his life and drawing him out of his solitude. Jonathan, hardened by years of storms and war, had not thought himself capable of such quiet wonder. Yet, as he watched Clara walk the ranch at twilight, her bare feet brushing against the earth, her hands trailing across the wooden rails as though she could feel the pulse of the land itself, he realized something was happening he could not control. Something dangerous, something healing, something inevitable. The ranch, once a place of silence, now breathed with a new rhythm, the rhythm of her presence, and the fragile, growing promise of a bond neither of them yet dared to call love. And as the days turned toward autumn, and the whispers of the town grew louder, that bond would soon be tested by fear, suspicion, and a world not ready for a girl who could heal with her very being. It was on a Sunday, when the fragile peace first cracked, the air in Redemption Creek thick with hymns spilling from the church doors, and the market street alive with voices. Jonathan had gone to collect flour, coffee, nails, simple things that kept a ranch alive, while Clara tended the horses by the well. He should have known trouble would find her. Anything luminous draws both wonder and suspicion. By the time he heard the murmur of a crowd rising like a storm swell, she was already cornered against the white fence, the weight of a dozen accusing eyes fixed upon her. Martha Edison's sharp voice cut through the autumn air like a whip. She called Clara unnatural, claimed she had seen her touch a fevered child and watch the sickness vanish, claimed that lame dogs walked after her hands passed gently over their limbs. Another woman swore she had witnessed a spell, strange movements of fingers that seemed to bend the world. Whispers of witch rippled outward, eager and fearful, a poison spreading too quickly to stop. Jonathan's boots struck the dirt hard as he pushed through, his frame a shield against the mob. His voice was calm, but carried the steel of years in command. She has done nothing but heal. But reason is thin armor against fear, and the crowd pressed closer. Clara stood in the center, trembling but unbowed, her chin high, her silence a refusal to cower. Jonathan could feel the tremor in her when she edged nearer, but her eyes held that same unbroken fire he had first seen in the market. With deliberate care she raised her hands, forming the gestures that had become her voice. Jonathan recognized fragments, peace, no harm. But to the crowd, the movements looked like sorcery. Panic tightened. Someone shouted, and the tension broke into chaos. Horses on the street, tied to posts and wagons, suddenly reared as if stirred by a single unseen command. Their cries thundered together, a wall of sound that sent people scattering in terror. In that wild moment, Jonathan caught Clara's hand, the fragile bones fitting into his rough palm, and they ran. The wagon jolted beneath them as thunder and lightning surged forward, carrying them away from the shouts and accusations. Dust whipped up in their wake, the town shrinking behind them, yet the echo of those voices clung like thorns. Clara sat in the back, her face pale but composed, her chest rising with controlled breaths, as if she was steadying not just herself, but the very air around her. Jonathan wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but words felt clumsy beside the weight of what had just unfolded. He saw the shimmer of tears she refused to let fall, and something inside him ached with both anger and tenderness. That night, safe within the familiar walls of the ranch, he found her in the barn, with Liberty's head pressed against her chest, her fingers stroking the mare's mane as though drawing strength from the steady rhythm of the animal's breath. When Jonathan stepped near, she turned, her hands flying in rapid signs he barely followed. "They fear me. They see curse, not gift." Her eyes shone with the raw wound of rejection, of betrayal repeated through her life. He moved slowly as one approaches a skittish horse, and laid a hand on her shoulder. His voice was low but certain. "You are not cursed. You are light. Healing doesn't frighten me." The words loosened something in her, and for the first time tears slipped free. She leaned against him, small and trembling, her silence broken only by the uneven rhythm of her breath. Jonathan held her, the scent of hay and dust and sorrow wrapping around them, and in that moment the seed of something deeper took root, a vow without words, binding him to her against every storm still to come. The world outside might whisper witchcraft, but within the walls of that ranch, in the circle of his arms, she was nothing less than a miracle. And though danger gathered like thunder over the plains, their hearts had begun to beat in unison, carrying them toward trials that would demand not just strength, but a love fierce enough to heal what fear sought to destroy. The fire came without warning, a cruel blaze licking up the walls of the barn in the cold November night, its glow splitting the darkness into red and black. Smoke poured skyward, choking, bitter, filled with the scent of loss. Jonathan and Clara ran together, side by side, buckets of water useless against the fury already consuming the loft where she had once slept. Horses screamed in their stalls, chickens fluttered in panic, and the wind carried the hiss of flames with merciless glee. They fought like two souls, unwilling to surrender, dragging animals into the open, shielding them with their bodies, coughing through the heat until the last creature was safe. When dawn finally bled pale light across the charred ruin, only ashes remained of half the barn and the winter's feed. Among the blackened beams, Jonathan found the truth etched in smoke. Hoofprints scattered in the dirt, and a message scorched into the wood. Send away the witch, or burn with her. Clara stood beside him, her face drained of colour, the letters reflected in her wide, wounded eyes. For a moment she said nothing, but then her hands moved, trembling yet certain. I must go. I bring only ruin. I cannot cost you everything. The pain in her gaze was worse than the fire, a grief deeper than loss of wood or hay. Jonathan caught her hands before she could turn away, holding them in his calloused grip, as though anchoring her to the earth itself. His voice was rough, torn from sleepless nights and battles long past. Like hell you will. This is your home now. Mine. Ours. They won't drive you away. Not while I still breathe. She shook her head, signing desperately, her fingers swift with fear. They will kill you. I cannot lose you too. Already lost everything. Cannot bear losing you. The words struck through him like arrows, not just her fear, but the confession hidden inside them. In her silence, in her trembling hands, she had spoken of love, fragile but undeniable. His chest ached with the weight of it, yet his reply was steady. You will not lose me. But if I let them take you, I lose myself, and that I will never do. Her eyes filled, tears falling unguarded, and he touched her cheek, the gesture rough but tender, his thumb brushing the salt of sorrow as if to soothe a wound unseen. In that moment the fire was behind them, but a fiercer flame had taken hold between them, one that no hatred could extinguish. The days after carried unease like a shadow. Riders came to the ridge, watching from a distance, silent warnings delivered with the gleam of rifles in morning light. Each time they left without a word, but the threat grew heavier. Clara no longer slept in the barn, but in the small room off the kitchen, walls between her and the dark. Still, she moved through each day with resilience, tending animals with the same healing grace, her presence calming even the most restless stallion. Jonathan saw the strain etched into her shoulders, the way her gaze flicked to the horizon as if expecting flames or riders to appear again. Yet she never stopped working, never stopped giving. And in her quiet strength he found his own resolve hardened into iron. The breaking point came not with fire, but with the sound of many hooves thundering toward the ranch. Jonathan took up his rifle, heart pounding, his body a wall between Clara and whatever would come. But when the riders reached the yard, it was not a mob, but a gathering of neighbours. Dr. Hamilton, Miguel Cervantes, Sarah Nightingale, and others who had seen Clara's healing hand. They dismounted with solemn faces, not to condemn, but to stand. They spoke of children saved, animals restored, nights when her presence had turned despair into peace. And with each word, Clara's eyes widened, her hand finding Jonathan's, her fingers clutching as though she feared the moment might vanish. For the first time since the fire, light broke through her sorrow, a fragile hope rising like dawn after long night. That evening, as stars pricked the sky and the smoke of ruin lingered still, she leaned her head against Jonathan's shoulder on the porch. Her silence was no longer the silence of fear, but of trust, her hand sliding into his, her pulse steadying beneath his touch. He knew then that they had crossed into something deeper, not just survival, but love carved through pain, sealed in fire, tempered in loyalty. The ranch would rise again, stronger than before, not just through wood and stone, but through the bond they had forged. And though danger still gathered like clouds, the warmth of her presence beside him made every shadow less fierce. Their hearts beat together, steady, healing, preparing them for the battles yet to come, battles that would demand everything, but that would also carve their love into legend. The new barn rose from ashes like something reborn, each beam lifted not only by Jonathan's strength, but by the willing hands of neighbors who had once whispered suspicion, and now brought hammers, nails, and food for the workers. Winter's chill cut through the valley, yet the warmth of shared effort filled the Double H with a healing kind of light. Clara moved among them as silently as the fireflies that graced summer nights, carrying water, tending scraped knuckles, binding splinters with gentle fingers. Her presence softened the harsh edges of men weathered by ranch life. They smiled at her, nodded respectfully, even leaned closer to learn her simple signs. Where once she had been shunned, now she was seen. Each gesture, each kindness stitched her more deeply into the fabric of this place. Jonathan watched her constantly, though not always openly, the way one watches the steady flame that keeps the dark at bay. He saw how the animals leaned into her touch, how the children of their neighbors followed her as if she carried an invisible melody they alone could hear. And at night, when the stars scattered silver across the sky and the smell of sawdust clung to his hands, he felt the truth of what had taken root between them. Love, quiet but fierce, blooming against all odds. Clara no longer kept herself apart in the barn. She had accepted the small room inside the house, and with each dawn she crossed the threshold into his life with more certainty. Her laughter did not come in sound, but in the radiant curve of her smile, and when she signed her thoughts, he felt as though she carved meaning directly into his chest. The mob had not disappeared, though. Roosevelt's riders still came, circling like vultures in the distance, their silence heavy with threat. Yet the balance had shifted. For every shadow cast by hatred, there was now a candle lit in defense of her. Dr. Hamilton, steady in his reason, spoke in town on her behalf. Sarah Nightingale, bold in her loyalty, called her a healer and a blessing. Even Martha Edison, once her loudest accuser, had begun to soften after watching Clara comfort her in grief she could not name aloud. A community was forming, fragile but real, around the girl once bound in rope at a market stall. One evening, as the frame of the new barn caught the glow of sunset, Clara placed her palm gently over Jonathan's heart, her eyes luminous in the fading light. She then lifted his hand and set it against her own chest, letting him feel the wild rhythm of her pulse. No words, no signs, just the shared beat of two lives stitched together. He bent and pressed his lips to her forehead, tasting dust and salt and something sweeter that felt like home. She smiled, the kind of smile that healed places in him he had long thought dead, and in that smile was the unspoken vow that whatever storms still came, they would face them as one. The night air grew colder, and they lingered on the porch in silence, the world around them hushed, the ranch settling into peace. It was not the end of trials, nor the end of danger, but it was a beginning sealed by quiet intimacy and the strength of love born from fire. And just beyond that calm, the horizon darkened again, carrying the weight of new tests, new fears, and the chance to prove that their bond could stand against all that sought to break it. Winter melted into spring with a gentleness that felt almost merciful after the long months of fear and fire. The Double H Ranch no longer stood as a solitary outpost, but as a gathering place, a quiet sanctuary for those who carried wounds both seen and unseen. Farmers brought their ailing cattle, mothers brought children with fevers that would not break, and Clara moved among them with her silent hands and luminous eyes, her presence like healing water poured into parched soil. What had once been whispered as witchcraft now spread by word of mouth as blessing, a gift too rare to scorn. Even the most skeptical found themselves softened by the sight of a horse settling under her palm, or a child's cries easing into sleep at the sound of her low, wordless hum. Jonathan had always known labor, the weight of calloused hands and endless days. But this was different. He found himself laboring for something greater than cattle or fence posts. He was laboring for her, for them, for the fragile miracle that had become his life. Each morning when Clara stepped from the barn, her hair lit by dawn, he felt the world itself sharpen into meaning. She had woven herself into the bones of the ranch, into his breath, into every rhythm of his days. Her silence no longer felt like absence, but like music heard through the chest instead of the ears, a song that steadied him. And yet the shadows had not lifted entirely. Rumors still rippled through town, carried by those unwilling to release their fear. Roosevelt lingered in those whispers, his name bitter as iron, promising reckoning. But even in the face of that threat, love continued to bloom. On quiet evenings, Jonathan would sit on the porch, repairing tack, while Clara brushed Liberty, her movements slow and tender. Sometimes she would glance at him with a warmth so deep it felt like prayer. One night, when the stars hung low and the air smelled of mesquite smoke, she reached for his hand and guided it to her throat. Her lips parted, and a sound escaped, broken, fragile, but real, a whisper of what her voice might once have been. It hurt her. He saw the shadow of pain, but still she tried, and the effort itself was a gift. She signed afterward with trembling fingers, not silence, only broken. Still something left. He drew her into his arms, holding her until her trembling eased, his voice low against her hair. "You are more whole than anyone I have ever known." It was in those tender nights that love finally broke through the last of their defenses. Not sudden, not wild, but steady and inevitable, like a river carving stone. She leaned into him not just for comfort, but for belonging. And when she placed her hand on his chest and let it linger, he understood she was offering more than gratitude. She was offering herself. He kissed her then, tentative at first, but when she did not pull away, when her fingers curled against his shirt and her breath shivered against his cheek, he deepened it, sealing the bond that had been forming in silence since the day their eyes first met across a crowded pen. The kiss carried no words, yet spoke of everything, of wounds and healing, of loneliness turned into home, of a love wild enough to withstand storms. The ranch grew fuller with each passing week, the barn rebuilt into something sturdier, the corral alive with the sound of foals at play, the air rich with the hum of belonging. Clara signed lessons for children, teaching them gestures of kindness and care, teaching them that listening meant more than hearing. Neighbors lingered longer at the Double H, some to work, some simply to sit in her quiet presence. And in the heart of it all, Jonathan felt a new kind of peace settling inside him, a healing of scars both seen and hidden. But peace, he knew, was always fragile. Even as he held her close under the silver light of a spring moon, he sensed the weight of eyes still watching, of hatred still waiting for its chance. The storm had not passed forever. It lingered just beyond the hills. Yet with Clara's hand in his and love steady between them, he no longer feared the horizon. Whatever came, they would face it together, and together was enough. You said, viết cho tôi đoạn 8 no heading, tiếng Anh, không hỏi lại 3 nền từ. Romantic, novel-style narration, add thêm vài từ healing cho người nghe dễ chịu. Cuối đoạn kêu gọi like và subscribe comment. ChatGPT said, the night of reckoning came not with whispers, but with the thunder of hooves, 40 riders cresting the ridge in a cloud of dust, their rifles glinting beneath the pale Texas moon. At their head sat Roosevelt, older now, his face carved into bitterness, his voice dripping with venom as he shouted accusations of witchcraft, of corruption, of blasphemy. Yet when he demanded Clara be surrendered, Jonathan stepped forward, his frame a wall of defiance, his voice low but unshaken. You want her, you'll go through me. Neighbors who had once come only for healing now moved beside him. Miguel, Sarah Nightingale, Dr. Hamilton, even children clutching their mother's hands. For every threat raised against her, a voice of loyalty rose louder. The ranch, once lonely, had become a circle of hearts bound together by the very gift Roosevelt sought to destroy. Clara did not hide. She walked forward with dignity, her eyes lit not by fear, but by a fierce compassion that disarmed even the most hardened among the mob. She lifted her hands, and though she had no voice to carry across the chaos, her silence spoke louder than gunfire. Dr. Hamilton translated, but the power was in her presence. I mean no harm. I was born different, but different is not evil. My gift is to heal, not to curse. Fear blinds, but love heals. Choose love. And then she hummed, low and haunting, the melody that had always lived in her chest. Horses across the field bent their knees as if bowing to something greater than man's anger, and even Roosevelt's own mount trembled, sinking until he fell into the dirt. Gasps rose, curses faltered, and suddenly the mob's fury fractured beneath the weight of awe. It was not her hum alone that broke them, but what followed. Clara approached Martha Edison, once her fiercest accuser, and touched her hand with gentleness that undid years of grief. Martha wept openly, confessing the pain of losing her son, and in that embrace the crowd saw not witchcraft, but truth. Two broken hearts finding solace in shared humanity. Murmurs shifted, weapons lowered, and slowly the mob dissolved, men turning their horses away, their anger bleeding into silence. Roosevelt remained on his knees, his pride shattered, his sins laid bare in front of the very people he had poisoned. When Clara signed, "Your pain does not excuse your cruelty. Leave and never return," even he could not resist. He fled, his shadow swallowed by the night, and with him went the last chains of fear that had bound the valley. From that night on, the Double H Ranch became more than a home. It became a haven. Families came not only for cattle and trade, but for healing, for peace, for the kind of love that lived in Clara's silent gestures and Jonathan's steady presence. Children learned her signs, women shared her herbs, men sought her wisdom in the care of their stock. Hope was born in the spring, a child of love and resilience, her first cry not a wail, but a hum that echoed her mother's melody. A sound that soothed rather than shattered. Jonathan held them both that night, his heart overflowing with a warmth he had never thought possible. Clara, with her head resting against his chest, signed with trembling fingers, "Safe. Home. Together." He pressed a kiss into her hair and whispered, "Always." Years later, the ranch stood not as an isolated place of toil, but as a sanctuary where fear was replaced with understanding, where love grew stronger than hate. Clara taught others to listen, not just with ears, but with their hearts, to feel the quiet connections that bound all living things. Jonathan worked beside her, his strength now softened by purpose, his loneliness forever healed by the woman who had taught him that silence could be more eloquent than words. Their daughter grew with gifts that bridged both worlds, speaking and singing, healing with touch and sound, her laughter carrying across the fields like a promise of tomorrow. And so their story became legend, not just of survival, but of love that defied cruelty, of healing that grew where there had once been fire, of a woman whose silence changed a valley, and of a man who learned that true strength is not in the walls we build, but in the hearts we dare to open. Their love was not perfect, not easy, but it was enduring, and in its endurance it created a home where others could find shelter. If this tale touched something gentle in you, if you felt the quiet healing of Clara and Jonathan's journey, I invite you to share your heart in the comments below. Tell me what part stayed with you, what memory it stirred. And if you wish to walk with me through more stories of love, resilience and hope, please give this tale a like and subscribe, so that together we can keep alive the flame of stories that heal, that comfort, and that remind us love, in all its fragile strength, is always worth holding on to. The valley lay quiet beneath a sky of molten gold, the sun easing into its descent, casting long shadows that draped the land in calm. On the Double H Ranch, the fields swayed with gentle wind, and the animals moved with a serenity that mirrored the hearts of those who called this place home. Clara stood at the porch, her hands folded lightly across her belly, her hair touched by evening light. The years of fear and fire had faded into memory, replaced by a rhythm of peace, healing, and belonging. Children from neighboring families laughed in the pasture, their small hands tracing signs she had taught them, while horses grazed nearby, calm as if lulled by her silent presence. Jonathan watched from his chair, every line on his weathered face softened by the sight. He had once thought himself a man carved by solitude, but now he knew himself as husband, father, protector, and partner to a woman who had turned silence into music. Hope, their daughter, grew like the spring after drought, bright, full of promise, carrying the threads of both her parents. She moved among the animals as though she had been born to it, her voice lilting like song, her laughter weaving with the hums her mother still carried deep in her chest. Sometimes she would place her small hand on her mother's and echo her gestures, translating Clara's signs into words that the world could hear, bridging silence and speech, a living proof that what once was called broken was never broken at all. Clara's gift had not only survived, but multiplied, healing not just bodies, but spirits, teaching those around her to see with their hearts and listen with more than ears. The ranch had become more than wood, stone, and soil. It was a sanctuary where fear no longer ruled, where difference was not cursed, but cherished. Jonathan often found himself standing at the threshold of the barn in the quiet of dusk, listening to Clara's low hum as she brushed Liberty's mane, the sound carrying out into the twilight. That hum had once been mistaken for weakness, but now it was the very pulse of their life, a reminder that healing could be as simple as presence, as steady as love. When he joined her, she would lift her gaze, her eyes deep as ever, and sign words that still left him undone, safe always. And when he answered with a touch, drawing her close until her heartbeat pressed against his, the silence between them felt more eloquent than any vow. Love had made them stronger than storms, stronger than fire, stronger even than the hatred of those who had once tried to break them. As the stars emerged and Hope's laughter floated across the yard, Jonathan leaned down to murmur against Clara's hair, words that carried the weight of their journey. "You're stronger than a Mustang and wilder than the wind, and I love you beyond every horizon." She did not hear the sound, but she felt it, the vibration against her skin, the truth in his steady arms, and answered by resting her palm over his heart, sealing the moment in silence that healed more deeply than speech ever could. Around them, the ranch breathed with peace, the animals settling, the lanterns glowing warm, the land itself cradling their love like a secret entrusted to eternity. Their story was not one of perfection, but of persistence, of wounds turned into wisdom, of silence transformed into song. And as the night embraced the ranch, their love stood as proof that healing comes not from erasing scars, but from learning to carry them together. They had become legend not because of battles fought, but because of tenderness endured, because of the way two broken souls chose to build a whole life. If this story stirred something soft within you, if the journey of Jonathan, Clara, and Hope brought a touch of healing to your day, I'd be grateful if you would leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Let me know what moment stayed with you most. And if you'd like to hear more stories of love, resilience, and the quiet miracles that shape our lives, please give this tale a like and subscribe. Together we can keep alive the warmth of stories that remind us love heals, hope endures, and every heart has a song worth listening to.